Right, well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening to those of you joining us virtually from around the world. My name is James Foster, Oliver T. Carr Professor of International Affairs and Professor of Economics, and former Director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we call it around here. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the fourth GW Conference on India's Economic Development and U.S.-India Economic Relations, also known as the GW India Conference. Today's event will focus on the question, making India an advanced economy by 2047. What will it take? India has come a long way since its independence in 1947. It has significantly reduced poverty, become the world's fifth largest economy, successfully chaired the G20 in 2023, and is the world's largest democracy. However, India still faces numerous challenges going forward, including growing inequality and climate change, among other problems. Additionally, the increasing importance of US-India economic and strategic relations makes its future development and challenges an area of great local interest as well. IIEP has hosted many major events focused on India. We have brought together top academic researchers, officials from the IMF, World Bank and OECD and the UN, and current and former high-level policymakers in the US and Indian governments to address questions of poverty reduction, job creation, market reform, regional and global partnerships, sustainable growth, and urbanization. Past speakers have included Arvind Subramanian, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and H.E. Harsh Vardhan Shringla, Ambassador of India to the US. IEP has also hosted an amazing virtual series organized with the Seeger Center for Asian Studies called Envisioning India, which has featured over 15 webinars on India's economy, environment, finances, and trade. Past events are available on the IIEP website and under the Envisioning India video series on our YouTube channel. Or you can just buy an associated award-winning book, Unshackling India, written by Salman Anis Soz and GW's own Ajay Chibber. At today's conference, we're thrilled to have 5 panel sessions, 2 keynote addresses, a thematic address, and 15 distinguished speakers from around the world. These speakers will address topics ranging from the middle income trap to trade policy to inequality and social inclusion. The topics of today's discussions are particularly pressing as international leaders gather only blocks away at the World Bank IMF meetings to discuss the global economy, of which India is growing as a key player. Today's conference has been organized by the Institute for International Economic Policy, a cross-university institute, which is located within the Elliott School of International Affairs. IIEP serves as a catalyst for high-quality, multidisciplinary, and nonpartisan research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization and international development. I'd like to thank IIEP Director Remy Jedwab, Assistant Director Kyle Renner, Madison Fallon, and all the IIEP staff for their support of today's conference. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy, the GW Center for International Business Education and Research, and the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, as well as IIEP's Executive Circle for all their support. Finally, I'd like to thank my fellow members of the organizing committee for putting together what I think is an outstanding program. They are Professor Deepa Olapalli, Professor Manny Teitelbaum, and IIEP Distinguished Visiting Scholar Ajay Chibber. I am now pleased to welcome the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs, Alyssa Ayres, who will be chairing our opening session with V. Anantha Nageswaran, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and Indermit Gill, Chief Economist of the World Bank. Dean Ayres is a foreign policy practitioner an award-winning author with senior experience in the government, nonprofit, and private sectors. She was appointed dean to the school in 2021. From 2013 to 2021, she was senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia on the Council on Foreign Relations, where she remains an adjunct senior fellow. From 2010 to 2013, Dean Ayres served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia. During her tenure at the State Department in the Barack Obama administration, she covered all issues across a dynamic region of 1.3 billion people at the time and provided policy direction for 4 US embassies and 4 consulates. Her work focuses primarily on India's role in the world and on US relations with South Asia in the larger Indo-Pacific. Dean Ayres is also interested in the emergence of subnational engagement in foreign policy, particularly the growth of international city networks. Her current book project examines India's urban transformation and its international implications. Dean Ayres will introduce this morning's speakers and moderate the audience Q&As. Dean Ayres, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podium. Take it over.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Let me also add my welcome to Professor Foster's welcome to you all. We're thrilled to have this incredible lineup of speakers for you today to take a look at what will it take to make India an advanced economy by 2047. As you know, this builds on, as Professor Foster noted, this builds on the incredible series of dialogues that we have had under the Institute for International Economic Policy umbrella, focused on India's economic growth, India-US economic relations, and all things India economy related. So that's the special area of emphasis, and I think we have terrific speakers to help kick off the program today. To answer the question here about what will it take to make India an advanced economy by 2047, we have a wonderful keynote address to get us started. We have the honor of hosting Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran, who is the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. I think most of you know that already. He will be delivering our keynote address this morning. Following his keynote address, we will also welcome Dr. Indermit Gill, who is Chief Economist of the World Bank, who will then deliver a thematic address. So this is a very exciting start. I think you can probably appreciate that some of what we are doing relates to additional meetings and schedules, given that this is a World Bank meeting week. So Dr. Gill will join us shortly later in this program. But I have to say, as dean of the school, I'm thrilled that we're able to bring such a deeply informed and distinguished set of panelists for today's conversations. India is an incredibly important economy. It continues its growth. India faces many challenges, but it also is looking to shape the world and the global economic framework around it. So I think being able to dive into questions of India's own growth and what remains on the pathway to becoming an advanced economy is our important contribution to the larger study of India and India's role in the world. Now, allow me to introduce our keynote speaker. This morning's keynote speaker, Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran, as I mentioned, is Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Prior to his current role, Dr. Nageswaran was part-time member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India for 2 years, and he is an honorary senior advisor to the International Financial Services Authority of India. Between 1994 and 2011, he held several positions, including currency economist at the Union Bank of Switzerland, head of research and investment consulting in Credit Suisse Private Banking in Asia, and head of Asia research and global chief investment officer at Bank Julius Baer. Dr. Nageswaran is a scholar and public servant with extensive writing over the years, including 4 books. He graduated from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, with a master's in business administration and received his PhD in finance from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Dr. Nageswaran will present this morning on India's path to an advanced economy, growth, and structural transformation. I will introduce Dr. Indermit Gill later once he arrives. So, Dr. Nageswaran, I call you to the podium. We look forward to your remarks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dean Ayres, for the kind words of introduction. It's indeed a privilege, honor, and pleasure to be here with you to share my thoughts on the important question for India. I would like to start by saying that in 1993, 2 years after India had embarked on an economic liberalization and reform program, after having faced a balance of payments crisis in 1991, India's nominal GDP in dollar terms was around $288 billion, to be very precise. I hope I'm right with that number. 30 years later, by March 23, the number was $3.4 trillion. And by the end of March 2024, this year, it was about $3.7 trillion. So we are talking about a rise of about 12 times in dollar GDP over the last 30 years. And this impressive growth translates into around 8.6% per annum in dollar terms, notwithstanding the fact that the Indian rupee, on average, has depreciated by about 3% every year against the US dollar. Now, the reason I mention this to set the stage is that notwithstanding the various challenges and issues, which are what I consider as work in progress or even as opportunities for further upside, the progress is undeniable in terms of some of these traditional markers that we focus on, such as GDP. And while there is a lot of discussion of India becoming the fifth largest economy, having become the fifth largest, and then on its way to becoming the third largest, etc., we should put these things in perspective in the sense that they are useful as important milestones, but they are not the ends in themselves. So if we maintain the kind of progress which we made in the last 30 years, or even better it somehow in the next 7 to 8 years, reaching a size of about $7 trillion in aggregate terms isn't that difficult in the next 7 years, because the rule of compounding tells you that to get to 7 trillion by 2031 is about 10% per annum that India needs to achieve a growth rate in dollar terms. That's not particularly daunting. But as I said, these milestones, while they are useful for media headline purposes, the underlying objective is naturally to ensure that growth of this nature translates into better living standards, employment, and income opportunities for the vast majority of Indians. So growth is a means to the end. But at the same time, while growth may not be a sufficient condition, it is definitely a necessary condition, because one cannot distribute economic stagnation, and that will bring only misery. We can only distribute economic prosperity. Therefore, I wouldn't want to underestimate the role that growth has to play in ensuring that the rest of India benefits from this growth. And that is where, in order to look forward, I would like to look back, at least since the turn of the millennium. While I mentioned that in 1991, we had the balance of payments crisis, and we embarked on economic reforms, when the new millennium arrived, India's economy was actually reeling from a few temporary but significant shocks. There was a non-performing loan situation in the banking system, 2 successive years of drought, and India was also facing sanctions for having tested a nuclear device in 1998. The technology sector in the US had actually peaked, and there were stock market corrections, 9/11 happened, etc. So there were a series of shocks from 1998 onwards, both domestic and global. And then they all slowly dissipated. And then from 2001, of course, in December, China became part of the WTO. And then from 2003, there was a synchronized global growth boom. And India also benefited from that. There was 5 years of high growth from 2003 until the global financial crisis struck in 2008. But what is interesting about that growth phase for India was that, of course, that was the time when the acronym BRICS was coined. And it was widely expected that India would sort of follow in the footsteps of China's impressive growth performance since 1979. And for a period, it looked as if it was going to happen. But there were certain underlying conditions which were still missing in the Indian growth story at that time, and I'll come to that. But the more important thing is, given that banking and bank credit in many of the economies is such an important part of the growth story, India's banking sector was more or less steady and stable, if you don't want to use the word stagnant, as a percentage of GDP in 1980s and 1990s. It was around 25 to 30% of GDP. It didn't move out of that range for a long time, 20 years. And then suddenly, in the first decade of the millennium, the Indian banking sector exploded. The ratio of bank credit to GDP actually doubled from around 28% to 58, 59% in just one decade. And imagine this happening in a decade when nominal GDP growth itself was very strong at about 14 to 15%. Then therefore, the numerator must have grown even faster. Very simple. So that actually had its own consequences. Like most emerging economies, India also faced a credit boom in the first decade, which was also turbocharged by global capital flows. And therefore, the second decade of the new millennium was a payback to the credit boom that we experienced in the first decade. Banking sector had to clean up the balance sheets, which happened for the better part of the second decade, 2015 onwards to be precise, because there was some initial reluctance to recognize the scale and the gravity of the problem in the banking system. And the corporate sector as well had to naturally pay back those loans. Therefore, they were selling off assets, consolidating, etc. So the consequences of this was bank credit growth came down to single digits, if at all. And investment by the private sector, corporate sector, was also weaker. So investment as a ratio of GDP declined in the second decade. And one of the big drivers of economic growth in the first decade of the new millennium was exports. That was also missing in the second decade because global growth, despite generous quantitative easing and zero interest rates, global growth didn't really pick up as well as one would have expected, given the kind of monetary accommodation that we saw in the developed world in the second decade. So that second decade, therefore, was a period of consolidation. Along with the balance sheet repair in the private sector, corporate sector, and in the financial sector, India also undertook several structural reforms. Goods and services tax was introduced. Some 480 tax rates of different state governments were consolidated into about 40 tax rates. And that has played its part in creating a single market in India. Today, for example, an average truck that used to cover about 200 kilometers a day, ferrying goods across the country, covers about 320 to 340 kilometers because some of the internal checkposts and restrictions on free movement of goods have been done away with. So therefore, there is an efficiency contribution coming from the goods and services tax, not only in terms of integrating the country as a single market, but also in removing frictions and inefficiencies. Then the more important reform was the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which, apart from giving creditors an option and a mechanism to recover their dues, has also brought about a behavioral shift on the part of the borrowers because they now know that they can lose control of the assets. So the repayment culture has benefited, although there are still challenges with the timeline it takes to conclude a resolution process. But definitely both goods and services tax and the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code not only were significant reforms, but they also weathered the COVID pandemic challenge that came in the way. And there were also reforms to the real estate sector. And several other initiatives which basically enable business conditions, starting a business or running a business, were also made easier. But the more important thing, of course, is to make sure that as the decade progressed, the banking system was put back in shape. And that was accomplished. But what happened? As soon as the banking crisis was drawing to a close, we had, of course, the pandemic shock. And as the pandemic wave ebbed towards the end of 2021, came the conflict in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, which for the first few months at least sent oil prices soaring. And then in 2022, we also had suddenly, after a long spell of zero interest rates, we had interest rates going up in 1 year by about 500 basis points in the US and somewhat less so in other parts of the advanced world. So India faced its own two big domestic shocks, which was the balance sheet crisis in the corporate and the banking sector, of course, the global shock of the pandemic, and then there were these minor shocks as well. So in spite of these, given the fact that India entered the third decade, with a much better banking system and a corporate system, very different from what it looked in 2013, a decade earlier, enabled the country to come out of the effects of the pandemic and be able to achieve a growth rate of 7% or more in the subsequent 4 years, including the current financial year, which began in April, 2 weeks ago. So now the biggest question mark on the way to being an advanced economy by 2047 is to sustain this. The recovery from COVID of around 7% or higher in real terms every year. What do we do to sustain this growth rate? The ability to sustain the growth rate is dependent on ensuring that India's supply side, the infrastructure, and the capacity of the economy to meet the demand is strongly in place. That is the difference between the next 25 years and the previous episodes of hope and promise, which were not fully realized, which is that India was always a supply-constrained economy. After 3 to 4 years of high growth, then naturally we ran into overheating conditions. We will face a high current account deficit, trade deficit, higher inflation, overvalued real exchange rate, and then the cycle will end and it will take another 2 to 3 years for the next cycle to begin. So we were basically having short-lived economic booms, which never sustained itself, for example, like how China was able to grow between 1979 and 2008 at the rate of roughly 10% per annum in real terms. So India needs to achieve, if not exactly a similar performance, but something approaching that to be able to realize its dream of being a developed nation by 2047. And that is one of the important things that the government has been able to do, which is to boost the supply side in terms of physical infrastructure. Whether it is in terms of creating national highways or airports, port handling capacity, electricity generation capacity, public transportation systems, the markers of physical infrastructure are very much evident to any average person visiting the country. In a gap of last 3 to 5 years, they can see the difference. So that gives us one confidence that we can sustain high growth for a longer period than before without running into overheating. The second reason for being somewhat hopeful or optimistic is that, unlike the second decade, today we have the private sector with very good balance sheets, and so is the banking system. Credit growth is beginning to happen. And the private sector investments, after the balance sheet issues of second decade and the pandemic-induced stagnation or decline, since 21-22, that also has begun to move into a higher gear. And as the private sector begins to invest in even increasing numbers, that will translate into employment generation, income growth, and consumption as well. Again, when I talk about the pandemic shock, we should remember that as an economy that was transitioning from poor or low income status to lower middle income status, India was shedding jobs in the agricultural sector, as one would expect. Between 2004 and 2019, on an annual basis, the decline in agricultural employment was between 1.6 to 1.7% per annum every year, which is what one would expect in a transitioning economy to higher income status. However, the pandemic reversed this 15 years of decline in agricultural employment. 40 million people migrated back from urban India to rural India in 2 years during the pandemic, 1920 and 2021, which naturally had two effects. One was that the income transfer from urban India to rural India naturally declined because we were people working in urban India and they had gone back to their villages. And given the excess supply of labor now in rural India, naturally real wages were also depressed. But the good news is that this process is now beginning to reverse. In 21-22 itself, manufacturing sector created 3.7 million jobs. And the manufacturing sector, unfortunately, wasn't doing that before the pandemic because of the balance sheet issues in the corporate sector. Manufacturing, surprisingly, or well, not so surprisingly, was losing jobs on a net basis between 2014 and 19. So some of the natural trends of growth are returning, which is a decline in agricultural employment, higher employment generation in manufacturing, private sector capital formation, bank credit growth, supply side endowment in the economy to be able to meet the growing demand. So these factors are in place to be able to sustain the growth rate and achieve the kind of numbers I mentioned at the very beginning of my remarks. What else needs to happen? As Professor Joan Robinson is supposed to have told her doctoral student way back in the 1960s or 50s to Dr. Amartya Sen that whatever you say about India, the opposite is equally true. Right? So we don't know if she said that, but that is widely attributed to her. One can always list any number of negatives for every positive that someone says and vice versa, and both would be right. That is why no single individual will be able to get the full picture. The scope is vast, and so is the country. Therefore, in the limited time I have, I will mention some of the challenges, and I don't see them as insurmountable. That is why in my initial remarks, I said, given all the challenges that India has faced and continue to face, there has been progress both in terms of absolute growth numbers or per capita incomes, etc., and reduction in poverty. But obviously, every phase of growth brings with its own set of challenges, and my good friend Indermit will talk about the middle income challenges. But for India, for the next 25, 30 years, the most important thing is to ensure, and as I said, there are plenty of issues. I will just confine myself to a few of them, which is that we need to continue to deregulate the economy. Because it's not about large enterprises, it's about small and medium enterprises. Today's prosperous countries, and I'll take two or three, for example, Japan, Germany, and Switzerland, did not get to where they are without having a vibrant Mittelstand. And that requires deregulation. Because these enterprises do not have the management bandwidth to be able to comply with the government, whether it is union, subnational, or local government requirements, and still be able to grow their business, whereas large enterprises can do so. Therefore, continued attention to deregulation, and that requires a mindset shift on the part of the bureaucracy. That is, do we place compliance as a non-negotiable goal and economic growth as a collateral benefit? Or do we place economic growth as a primary goal and compliance as a collateral requirement? There are two different ways to frame the issue, and the bureaucracy has to choose the second one. That has to happen at all levels of government, national, subnational, and so on. The second challenge I would pose is how do we ensure energy security for the Indian economy when there is so much talk of energy transition. And there, I think, the global discourse, which has moved away from the Paris Agreement, which clearly said there are common responsibilities, but they're also differentiated. And national capabilities are different. So this is my own timer. So I have finished 20 minutes. I have finished 20 minutes. I'll take probably a couple of more minutes to. I want to hear you. So we naturally have to understand that today's developing countries need the kind of affordable and reliable energy that allowed today's advanced economies to grow the way they did. Even China, in its economic transformation, did not have to face the kind of pressure that today's developing countries face, like India, the low-income countries. But what is missing in the discourse around the world is the recognition of trade-offs. Because any economic policy decision is a matter of choosing between two competing alternatives, and it is the net cost benefits that needs to be taken into consideration when countries are being urged to pursue energy transition. But unfortunately, the current global narrative is more in terms of putting forth corner solutions. But whether it is addressing economic growth or addressing climate change and energy transition, all of these exercises are constrained optimization. And more importantly, without achieving economic growth, countries like ours will not have the resources required to be able to undertake the energy transition. And national income accounting will tell you that if you're going to rely on external resources, even if they're available, which they are not, then the amount of current account deficit we will run to be able to do the energy transition will run into such high levels that the financial markets will protest and the currency will collapse and interest rates will go up. So even to undertake successful energy transition, countries have to prioritize economic growth. And India is doing its own bit in terms of moving away from fossil fuels, because it has set for itself the target of achieving 50% of non-fossil fuel generation capacity by 2030, and it is actually ahead of the milestones required to achieve that number. And these numbers were actually raised in 2022, having set a slightly lower target in 2015. And also the energy intensity of economic growth has been declining in the country. So the point I'm making is that while all countries are aware of their obligations, but the underlying premises obligations are different. And there are resources that are required. And from the point of view of energy transition itself, countries need to be allowed to own the problem, and ownership of the problem of energy transition will happen in developing countries, provided they have the confidence and the resources and economic growth to back it up. So the current discourse is making that extremely difficult and challenging. That's the second challenge, therefore, I would mention as what might come in the way of achieving this status. And the last point is, of course, and this includes gender, it includes youth, education, skilling, and labor force participation, or the other domestic challenges. We have come a long way, because several years ago, India used to face the challenge of enrollment in educational institutions, but enrollment is no longer the challenge. In fact, in the last 10 years or so, the gross enrollment ratio of women in higher education has outpaced the enrollment of men. The ratio used to be 76 to 100, women to men, but now it is 98 to 100. The gap is closed. And more Indians in rural India and more women than men in rural and urban India are taking to higher education than before. And these are very heartening developments. But what we need to ensure is that learning outcomes happen and there's right kind of skills to be able to participate in the manufacturing sector, but also to be able to withstand the onward march of technology. We have to reconcile the two. It's not easy. Many countries face the challenge of whether AI will create jobs or destroy jobs on balance. But the challenge is more acute for developing countries, particularly for India, given its labor force size and so on. And therefore, we need to also expect the private sector to take a longer term view of these things, whereas it's very tempting initially to deploy technology on a massive scale because it saves on labor costs and generates profits. But naturally, without social stability, without income growth, as they used to say, robots can produce cars, but robots cannot buy the cars that the companies produce, right? So if you deploy more robots in the production process, you need to have people with incomes to be able to buy the products we create with the technology. So these are the key challenges we face. Deregulation, marrying energy transit security with energy transition, ensuring adequate skilling, learning outcomes for Indian youth, and also to be able to raise the level of productivity while creating jobs. And I don't mention these things as insurmountable because India's journey over the last 30 years tells us that most of these obstacles and hurdles have been transformed into opportunities for growth. Therefore, I'm confident that these challenges that I mentioned will also become similar stepping stones in our journey to becoming a developed nation by 2047. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nageswaran. It is my honor now to introduce and to welcome to the podium World Bank Chief Economist Indermit Gill for his thematic address to follow, and then we will be joined in a conversation and take Q&A. Dr. Gill, before starting his current role as Chief Economist and Senior Vice President for Development Economics, Dr. Gill served as the World Bank's Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance, and Institutions, where he helped shape the bank's response to the extraordinary series of shocks that have hit developing economies since 2020. Between 2016 and 2021, he was a professor of public policy at Duke University and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Global Economy and Development Program. Dr. Gill led the World Bank's influential 2009 World Development Report on Economic Geography. His work includes introducing the concept of the middle income trap to describe how countries stagnate after reaching a certain level of income. He has published extensively on key policy issues facing developing countries, among other things, sovereign debt vulnerabilities, green growth and natural resource wealth, labor markets, and poverty and inequality. He is also taught at Georgetown University and the University of Chicago. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, and he will speak this morning on how can India avoid the middle income trap. May I call you to the podium, Dr. Gill? We look forward to your remarks.
Okay, thanks very much for this, Dean. And thank you also to James for asking me to talk here, and Ajay and Anant so I'm really sorry that I came late, but I caught enough of your presentation to be able to contextualize mine a little bit. So I'm going to talk about so actually Anant talked about India's recent history and immediate future. So I'm going to expand the scope a bit. So I will talk not just about India, but about all middle-income countries, and there are about 100 of them. Then I'll talk about the last 4 decades, not just the last 10 years or so. And then I'll talk about the next few decades, not just the immediate thing. And of course, that part is common with what Anand said, because he was also talking about 2047. So just to start things a bit, I would say there are 2 points on which I agree with Anand, and there are 2 points on which I disagree, and 1 point on which I agree. So, but I think that my disagreements are minor, okay? So the first one, he said to deregulate enterprise, and he focused on small and medium enterprises. And the work that we have been doing at the World Bank is basically that actually indicates that that one shouldn't focus on the size of an enterprise at all. You should be thinking about the value added of firms. And so you should be thinking about regulating large, medium, small, micro enterprises all well, rather than focus on a size as a superficial indicator. The correct indicator is value added, okay? And that has data implications. It means that you have to have better data. The second one, exactly as he said that India has to use its talent well. So he spoke about learning outcomes, he spoke about higher education and so on. The way that we have been looking at it is that these middle income countries actually have a lot less talent than higher income countries, which is to be expected. And so they should, of course, they should actually encourage a greater accumulation of this talent through higher education, better learning outcomes, and so on. However, they actually use this talent much worse than high income countries. And that won't get solved if you just actually accumulate more talent and so on. You also have to solve the problem of allocating talent to task. Okay? The third part, and so you shouldn't be looking at things like inequality and so on, which are static indicators of this efficiency. You should be looking at socioeconomic mobility. And for that, again, you need much better data. But without that data, you'll get it wrong. The third part has to do with energy security. So there I agree with him. So I agree with him that what India requires and what all these middle income countries require is reliable and affordable energy. I think that I would agree with him also that but I would agree the work that we are doing it points to the fact that we are using a very superficial indicator of the energy transition. We are looking at sources of energy. Okay. And these are not a good indicator. The correct indicator is energy efficiency, at least from the viewpoint of middle-income countries, it is energy efficiency. So the sort of things Anand said about the fact that emissions intensity has been declining as India grows, that's the right indicator to look at, not the sources of energy as much, right? It is emissions per unit of value added, I would say, okay? And he's right about the fact that obligations are different under these agreements and so on, and they're different when it comes to energy consumption. But obligations should probably not be different when it comes to energy efficiency. And so I actually believe that many of these countries are actually meeting their obligations when it comes to reducing or to increasing energy efficiency, okay? All right, so that's all that stuff is just a teaser. I'm going to go through this report. And by the way, we had done the 2009 World Development Report, and I really like the fact that Dean Ayres said that was a very influential one, but that won't be nearly as influential as a report that Soumik Lal, I don't know where he is, there he is. So that won't be nearly as influential as this one, which is just about to hit the stands, okay? Right. Now if I can just move the slides. Or maybe I just stop here and okay. So here are the three parts of that report. The first part of the report, of course, are the facts. And so I won't take up too much time, Dean, but essentially, as I said, that you've got about 108 economies. They have aspirations of getting to high income. And the second chapter actually looks at this and says that the odds of these countries to actually get to high income were never that good, and they're getting worse, right? And then the third one is that when you actually look at these countries more closely, you actually find that a big part of what is needed to grow through middle income quickly are these two transitions that I'll tell you about. And what that requires is a constant change in the structure of these economies. And we essentially see growth slowing down in these countries in terms of the next decade or so. And we also sort of see structural stasis in the sense of a slowdown in terms of structural reforms in these countries. So for all of these reasons, we actually feel that, you know, that there is enough to worry about something called the middle income trap. There has been a debate about this for the last 15 years or so, but I think that the people who are not debating this generally are the policymakers. It's only people who have a lot of time on their hands, and they're the ones who debate these things. Okay. The second part, of course, is to sort of look at, to try to tap not just the lessons of experience, but also the advances in theory. And what we tried to do here was to try to bring in the insights that have come from the theories of creative destruction into the thinking about why these countries appear to be trapped, and what are the sort of solutions, the kind of hints that come from this theory about what they need to do. And one of the things that, of course, we learned was that the theories of creative destruction have actually gone through 3 generations. So the first was Schumpeter, the second one was essentially Philippe Aghion and his co-authors, and then there's a third strand of this, which is actually the most promising for middle-income countries, and this is the part that Shomik and his team actually collaborated a lot with the people who are actually working on these things, people like Ufuk Azigit at the University of Chicago, right? And then what we end up doing is that we end up applying these to the things that Anant mentioned: enterprise, talent, and energy. Okay, so in fact, this report is quite tailor-made for countries like India, and that's not a coincidence, because actually people like Anant had a lot to say in terms of the design of this report. He may not like the conclusions, but he would definitely like the scope of this report. Okay, all right. And then the last thing, of course, what we sort of say is that, look, it's going to be a very difficult thing for these countries to actually escape the trap and to sort of get to high-income economy advanced economy status by 2047. But they would have to sort of, the way that we do this is they would have to do kind of the sort of things that South Korea did over the last 50 years, which was the way that Bob Lucas put it, was making a miracle. So they would have to make miracles, basically, right? Okay. Especially for countries like India, by the way, just the size also matters a lot. So South Korea had some things going for it. For India, it's going to be even harder because of the size. For India, it's going to be even harder also because of the changes that have been taking place over the last few decades. The environment is going to be much tougher for India than it was for South Korea. So just so you know, these are so these are the middle-income economies. You have essentially, you have countries that are called lower middle-income countries by the World Bank. These are countries that have per capita incomes between about $1,300 and $13,000, roughly speaking. Lower middle and upper middle, and the upper middle income countries are from 5,000 to 13,000. So 1,300 to about 5,000, and then 5,000 to about 14,000. And you sort of see over here is that they have about 75% of the world's population. So these are the most important countries for the global economy now. The second one is, if you look at the GDP, is about 40% and growing as a share. If you look at the extreme poverty, they still have a large part of the extreme poverty, especially among the lower middle income countries, as you see over there. And then finally, if you look at the emissions, you sort of see that they are now more than half of the emissions of the thing, and they're set to grow, right? So they're about 67% or something of emissions, right? So if you have any questions about these numbers and so on, you should ask Shomik, he's right there. Okay, yeah, okay. So this is a chart that actually shows you what the progress has been. So actually, you know, we thought that there was a lot of progress that has happened over the last 3 decades. That, you know, and then when you think about this a little bit more, you realize that actually what we've been doing is that we've been using this metric of extreme poverty reduction, and of course that has dropped a lot over the last 3 decades, right? It's gone down from about 66% of the world to about 6% of the world, and so on. And so we said these have been great decades for development. Then when you look at the middle income countries, you sort of say, okay, well, that metric may have been something that's essentially a hangover from the past. Back in the 80s and so on, that wasn't a bad metric, you know? But now if you sort of think about it, you really do want these countries to become closer to the per capita income of advanced economies, or that of the US, which is the one that's used as the energy frontier. And you sort of see over here is that, you know, I mean, the thing that strikes you here is the lack of catch-up, okay? So actually I actually asked our team to add up. So, you know, we have been seeing that countries have actually become they have become middle income, or they become high income from middle income at a fairly steady pace, about one country per year over the last 34 years. So 34 countries have gone from middle income to high income, right? And that doesn't look like a bad pace, right? But then when we sort of look at them more closely, we find that if you add up their populations, it adds up to the population of Pakistan, right? And while it would have been really nice for Pakistan to become a high-income economy over the last 34 years, nobody would be happy with that, right? I mean, we would want more than that, right? Okay, so that's the extent of the countries that have gone on to high income. And then if you look at the pace, so this is from a long-term growth model that we have. If you look at this, you actually find that the prospects of, let's say, India catching up, not catching up, but getting to 25% of US per capita incomes is going to take 75 years. So, I think for people like Anant and others, don't set the goal as a share of US per capita income. Set the goal some other way, because otherwise you're going to take a long time to get there. Okay. So these, by the way, are the countries that are catching up. Then Shomik tells me that there are other countries that are actually falling behind. So if you sort of look at countries like Brazil and Mexico and others, they would actually be going the other way, right? So they'll take about roughly 50, 60 years to get to 10% of US GDP per capita. They're going the other way because they're actually higher shares right now. Okay? I'm taking too long. The other thing is that, if you look at the aspirations of these countries, Anant mentioned some of those things, but that's a very common aspiration, and it should be, right? So if you sort of look at China, it has a plan to sort of expand the middle class, grow. India, Vietnam, South Africa, you can go down the list of all these countries. There's no reason why they shouldn't have these aspirations, and they do. Okay. And like I said, there were these 34 countries. They don't add up to that much. By the way, these countries sort of are like 2 or 3 sets of countries. The first one, of course, are the countries that joined the European Union. That has helped a lot. The second group of countries are small island states and others, like Tobago, like Trinidad and Tobago. And then you've got some other countries, mostly natural resource-rich countries that actually have, I think, the countries that we always talk about as successes are countries like Korea, but those kind of genuine successes are rare, right? So you do have countries like Korea, Poland, Chile, and others who have actually done this. And in the report, we actually pay a lot of attention to those countries just to sort of see. And then we actually, spend quite a bit of time taking stock of when is it that these countries hit this sort of wall, in a sense. And you find that they hit the wall roughly at around 10% of US per capita income, right? So it's fairly early on. And by the way, there's another chart over here that shows that if your institutions are weak, and you can measure these any way you want, you hit that much sooner. You hit that wall much sooner, right? So essentially, less economic freedom and actually less political freedom, and all of this leads to you hitting that growth slowdown much sooner. So we can stand by these numbers. We've actually spent a lot of time about it, right? Now, then we sort of say, okay, what are the growth strategies that have actually served these countries well? And we sort of think of these as like, our first strategy, the first strategy I would call 1I, which is just investment. So if you look at low-income countries, capital accumulation gets you a long way, okay? The problem is that you start to sort of hit diminishing returns very quickly. And so the second part that we sort of say is that they need to switch to a 2I strategy, which is investment plus infusion. And by infusion, we mean bring in technologies from abroad and diffuse them very widely in your country, okay? And then the third one is investment plus infusion plus innovation. We call that a 3I strategy. That's the strategy for a country like China, for example. It has to sort of do all of that things. these are very rough generalizations, but they're not misleading generalizations in the sense that when countries have tried to sort of skip that infusion stage and go straight to innovation, they have generally failed. Those are the countries that I didn't show you on that chart. They're the ones that are not converging anymore. Okay, countries like Brazil and countries like Mexico. Okay. And so then we sort of say over here, first infusion, then innovation. I won't get too much into this because I know that we are running out of time. And then, so, here, here are the, here are the prospects. We say they're getting grimmer. These are the countries that we say, the thing that struck us about these countries is that one was they were very intentional about that infusion stage. In the case of Korea, most so, but Poland as well, Chile too. I should shut up. Okay. 1 minute, 1 minute. I don't think. Okay. So we have these really nice charts in the report, like exactly what happens to Korea. First, it tries to sort of get these technologies from Japan. Then that becomes harder. So they switch their policies much more to innovation from infusion, those kind of things. I will skip this and I will tell you just, so this is what happens when you try to sort of leapfrog. So Brazil's per worker productivity was nearly 50% back in the 70s. It's now down to about half that. And in the case of Korea, you see that it was around 20-something% back then, and it's now more like 66%, 70%. Now, so I'll just end with this slide. So essentially, this is the best way to sort of summarize the progress in theories of creative destruction. And if you sort of look at the first one, basically that's the Schumpeterian one, that you have these incumbents, they don't want new entrants come and they destroy the old model, they come up with new models and so on, and these incumbents have to then leave, right? So that's the first one. The second one has to do more with the fact that you actually don't have incumbents actually collaborating with each other and so on, but still they do make it difficult. They do make it difficult to have essentially new entrants coming in and so on. So the challenge of new entry is somewhat less hard in the Aghion and Howitt framework of this one. And then there's a third one, which is the one that we use, and that has to do with the fact that you actually find that incumbents can actually help new entrants. And this is when you start to sort of think about value chains rather than output of each firm and so on. You actually find that small firms can actually benefit from large incumbents, through essentially becoming suppliers to them also, but also supplying them ideas, right? And so you sort of see that a lot. So in a sense, it becomes much harder for a regulator to regulate these things well, but it becomes impossible for them to regulate well if they use the superficial indicators of size, of just how much higher education you have, etc. It becomes much harder for you to do it. And just so you know, we actually find that the Schumpeterian, the original Schumpeterian view actually conforms pretty well to the energy sector, because you have these incumbents and they're, for most middle-income countries, these are state-owned enterprises and they don't want new entry, okay? And then when you look at the talent part, it's actually the part that Philippe Aghion and Howitt think. When it comes to enterprise, it's much more complicated. It looks more like this. That's the problem that Anant and his policymaker friends have to deal with in India. It's not an easy one.
I'd like to just begin things by asking you both to briefly offer some reflections as you think about, the theme of our conference. You spoke about the most important next step should be deregulation to get the economy moving. You've spoken about avoiding the middle income trap. It's a huge challenge. You've both spoken in your remarks about the purpose of growth is to ensure livelihoods, to ensure jobs for people, to create opportunity. Can you reflect a little bit on next steps for India in, let's say, the next 5 years?
So more immediately in the next 5 years would be to, I have to get down to specifics because I spoke about the two important reforms of the second decade, both the goods and services tax and the insolvency and bankruptcy code. It's important to evaluate them every few years, let's say 5 or 7 years. Now that we have seen them through for 7 years, they have survived the pandemic and many shocks. We have to look at what is GST 2.0 will be like, because some products are still excluded, energy products and the real estate sector. And so what will be the shape? And in the process of arriving at consensus over the last several years, the architecture also has become a little bit complicated. So we need to simplify that. The same thing applies to the insolvency and bankruptcy code. And more importantly, if we have to sustain the investment rates, we may not be able to go to the East Asian investment rates. It may not even be desirable. But to be able to sustain the investment rates, we need to have a sense of what kind of financial sector we need to have, what kind of capabilities we need to have in banking, in capital markets, etc. And just as the goods and services tax was a great indirect tax reform, we also need to take a look at the direct taxes. So these are all some important topics. I mean, the list can be longer than this, but I would mention these as important issues to address for the next several years. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gill, what would you say?
So I would say three things. The first one is India probably needs to rethink the old ideas about, that India can just sort of, India doesn't need to do the manufacturing push. India can just do a services push. I think because of changes in technology, especially because of changes in technology, I think India will have to, despite the fact that India is quite a leader in the digital transformation, India will probably have to step up the pace even on that. But I think a big part of this will have to be to sort of re-examine the services-led enterprise sector kind of thing. The second one on the talent part, I think that India has a huge reservoir of talent that it doesn't use well already. And I think Anant mentioned some of that. I mean, when we were looking, for example, at the numbers, the share of people at MIT and Caltech who were women, and compared that with India's IITs, it was night and day. And I know that lots of changes have been made on that one, but more changes have to be made there. And then the third one, I guess on the energy transition, I think that Anant and others have it right. But I think there the big problem in the case of India will be to sort of deal with the state-owned enterprises.
Let's open this up to Q&A. Yes. And we have a mic coming around to make sure that those who have joined us online can also hear the questions in the room. The mic's coming to you. Yes. The mic helps our online participants hear. Thank you.
Anant, first of all, a great presentation. Some of it was music to my ears. Two quick questions. Number one, you all use the word advanced economy. Besides the per capita income, in fact, you've been using GDP. Besides per capita income, what are your indicators of an advanced economy? Let me say why it's genuine, because I think the guy who has done it best in India, I've heard when he was Prime Minister Modi, when he laid out his vision of an advanced economy before he got elected to the NASSCOM leadership. Second question, again, the three areas, I incidentally agree with you, I don't agree with Indermit. So
you're wrong and I'm right.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I know
question. You've said small scale industry, energy security, and let's call them various social indicators. What is the government doing, to actually address those? I have not seen anything. All the discourse, for example, on deregulation tends to be on big things. What is happening that is making life simple for small scale? Energy, yes, we are doing renewables, but nothing is sustainable unless you address the, let's call it the nuclear versus gas problem. Nothing seems to be in the discourse there. So could be more specific?
I think the question is to
you.
you. Yeah.
Well, he's just thinking all wrong about it. But I want to answer the question that he asked.
It's a very lively environment here.
I'll take you on later.
No, I'll give you a very short answer. The short answer to the thing, what are the distinguishing features of an advanced economy? Efficiency, total efficiency. In the case of enterprise, converting capital to output.
Okay, we'll let our speakers answer.
I think apart from GDP per capita, you look at, as you mentioned, productivity, but you look at a whole range of human resource indicators, such as infant mortality, literacy rates. So I think it's difficult to go into what are all the various indicators that would characterize an advanced economy. It is not just about GDP growth or ownership of consumer durables and assets. It's also human resource development evolution indicators would constitute what distinguishes an advanced economy from an advancing economy. The second point about what is being done, I think, see, there is a static view and there's a dynamic view. Static view is that these things are still important problems, but the dynamic view recognizes that when it comes to MSMEs, the entire digital infrastructure is actually making credit more accessible to them. They're able to now access credit based on their cash flow patterns rather than relying on collateral. The budget of 23-24 last year in February introduced a very important nudge provision that large enterprises cannot claim tax deduction for payments due to MSMEs unless those payments have actually been made rather than on an accrual basis. And the thresholds for what constitutes micro, what constitutes small, and what constitutes medium have been revised higher as well. So these are all, and receivables exchanges have been created, which allow large enterprises to discount those bills and for MSMEs to discount those bills and get the payment instantly, whereas the buyers settle with the financial institutions later. And the goods and services tax invoices are going to become collateral for working capital loans for MSMEs. These are all the various steps that are happening. But as I said, your question is important, but it needs a much lengthier answer. I just gave you a gist of what is being done.
Okay, next question, right here.
Thank you both for your presentations. So my question is just, I'm Sadanand Thume. I work at the American Enterprise Institute, and I write a column on India for the Wall Street Journal. So I guess I'm trying to square both of your presentations, right? So Ananth, for you, so let's just say Indermit is right, and it's going to take 75 years for India to get to 25% of US per capita GDP. Now, and in your sort of presentation, which is sort of more optimistic, right? You think that if everything goes right and India overcomes the challenges that you laid out, it can get to high income or developed status by 2047. Does that mean that you think that it can get to something approximating that, even if it's at a relatively low percentage of US per capita GDP? Or are you saying that, in fact, you think that India would get to, say, 40 or 50% of US per capita GDP? So to what degree are you disagreeing, or to what degree are you just sort of measuring or looking at things differently?
No, I think I don't want to go down that path at all, because to say that India would reach $20,000 per capita, which is, let's say, 25% of the US per capita GDP today, because if India with its size tries to emulate the consumption patterns and both in respect to consumer assets or durables or spending, it is not sustainable for the world also. And I think the contexts are different. So I think it is whether to be called an advanced economy is to have a per capita income of $60,000 US. That's not the way to evaluate this thing at all. It's given the size and given, and in those days, this entire talk of environmental and climate sustainability were not the constraints that those countries faced. So we need to be, therefore, realistic, and also what is sustainable given the Indian context. And if that income, and I think in any of our discourses in neoclassical economics or anywhere, contentment and satiation are not part of the model at all. So I think if you view those things, if you factor those things in, whether we hit 10,000 or somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 per capita is relatively not the most important way to measure whether a country has become advanced or not.